Hi everyone, this is Thomas Hawson from Three Hare Court and welcome to Three Hare Court Sports Law Team's second podcast. I'm joined today by Julia Lewis, a barrister at Three Hare Court. And in this episode, Julia is going to be looking at what sports bodies, clubs and individuals are facing and doing in respect of government guidelines for the returning of sporting events and for fans' attendance at sporting events. And well, Julia, there's been quite a lot going on, hasn't there?
There has, Tom, yeah. And today, what I'd like to look at is the impact of the rise in COVID cases and two pieces of new national guidance, which I'm sure listeners will be well aware have come into force over the past couple of weeks. So the first being from the 14th of September, we had the health protection, brackets coronavirus restrictions, brackets number 2, brackets England, brackets amendment, brackets number 4 regulations 2020. I'll try not to use the titles too much. And of course, those introduced the rule of 6 as law so that people may not meet up indoors or outdoors in general terms in groups of larger than 6. And then secondly, about a week later, from the 25th of September, we had the health protection, and I'll shorten it, number 5 regulations 2020, which extended that rule of 6 to some sports activities. And what I'd like to do today is have a look at what those regulations, as well as the changing landscape generally in the rise in cases, means for sports activities in 3 areas. The first being the return of fans or not to organised sports. The second being what are those restrictions which have come in, particularly on amateur team sports. And thirdly, what's the impact on mass participation events and getting back up and running with those kinds of events. So the first one we'll look at is the return of fans to stage at professional sports in England. And again, as listeners are aware, I'm sure, elite sports resumed in England in mid-June, with the vast majority of those being played behind entirely closed doors really over the summer. So we had the Premier League returning in mid-June and the FA Cup final at the beginning of August. We had the men's England cricket tests, which were played against the West Indies, Ireland, Pakistan and Australia, and England women's cricket being played against the West Indies. Formula One at Silverstone in August. And in respect of all of those, as I said broadly that there were no fans at all. And I think it's fair to say that there have been a number of sort of false starts really in terms of getting fans back into the stadia. It was always the intention from the return in June to move through the summer with a sort of progression of pilot events, having a small number of fans and hopefully getting back to fans in events at some scale by October. And as I say, there have been a number of false starts, and I think that really started at the end of July when the government had to postpone allowing fans at pilot events after the first spike in cases. So that particularly affected the World Snooker Championship at the Crucible, who had admitted fans on the opening day. They were allowed to stay on for that day, but then for the rest of the week, it was held behind closed doors, apart from a limited number of 300 fans at the final. Spectators weren't permitted at county cricket matches as they'd planned to. And there had been plans to allow 4,000 spectators at Goodwood, which were cancelled at short notice after another spike. As I've said, the plan really was for there to be a number of pilot events and the hope that by the beginning of October, there would be fans back in stadia at a capacity of around 25 to 35%. And of course, that would have tied in reasonably well with the beginning of the 2020 and 2021 season for England football, that having started a couple of weeks ago now. And of course, as I'll go on to discuss, there are a huge range of reasons why fans, athletes and clubs are absolutely desperate for the return of fans to the stadium. And it's also fair to say that there were a number of successful pilot events which were held in August and early September across football, rugby union, cricket and snooker. But again, going back to that false start premise, there's been disappointment for fans as well. So the St. Leger Horse Racing Festival in mid-September had 2,500 spectators on the first day, and then again, similar to the snooker, were told to stop spectators attending thereafter. So I think that if ever there was a time when the term moving goalposts is appropriate, this is certainly it, because it's just changing all the time, really.
You've got to get at least one sports joke in there, haven't you?
Well, exactly. It was a pretty apposite pun, right? And so by mid-September, the 14th, as I say, when the rule of 6 was introduced with the number 4 regulations, it was clarified that fans returning to the stadia, because they have been transformed into COVID-secure environments, and that was planned in accordance with government guidance and, of course, strict protocols, that technically that return would be compatible with the rule of 6. But unfortunately, that doesn't mean that those plans are actually going ahead. So there had been plans, the hope was that they could move from stage 4, which was return of cross-border competition with no spectators, to stage 5, which was the return to competition, safe return of spectators, of course, in a socially distanced way. And there was the pilot weekend on the 18th and 19th of September, where 8 pilot fixtures allowed the return of 1,000 fans each to a number of EFL fixtures. But then very shortly after, so about a week after the introduction of that rule of 6, on the 22nd of September, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport held a meeting with sports governing bodies, including football, rugby, cricket, Formula One and horse racing, in which the DCMS announced the postponement of pilot events programme and told the governing bodies essentially to prepare for no spectators throughout winter. And that was in line with moving the UK generally from the COVID-19 alert level up to 4, which means that transmission is high or rising exponentially. And of course, just a few days later, further restrictions were also brought in for hospitality businesses and indoor sports, which I'll talk about in a little bit.
That announcement there of not going ahead with those pilot schemes in the EFL is, and with football and other sports generally, the reaction to that was pretty great. I know a lot of the EFL clubs, particularly in Leagues 1 and League 2, and even in the Championship to a certain extent as well, were devastated, because they are missing out on so much revenue by fans not being able to attend, even in reduced numbers. And even more so when you look at the National League as well. Again, they have very reduced stadia capacity, but that additional revenue they can get from fans, and whether it's buying drinks or and so on and so forth on the day, for them in terms of turnover, it's a really significant factor, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings us really to the question of what are the costs of not allowing fans to return. And of course, there's a lot of scrutiny and there's pressure on the government to get this right, because back in March, in the early days of COVID, that they were under criticism for letting big events go ahead. So at the moment, there's an investigation into allowing Liverpool's Champions League fixture against Atletico Madrid, which went ahead in mid-March. And there have been calls for investigation into whether the horse racing Cheltenham Festival should have gone ahead again at the same time. But I think it's important to bear in mind that those were events, obviously, which were going ahead in accordance with normal protocols. They both had 50,000 to 60,000 spectators per day. And what we're now looking at, as you say, with the pilot events programme, is what are the costs of allowing a fraction of those numbers, measured against the financial and social cost of not allowing the spectators back in those numbers. And as you say, that the financial cost for clubs is really pretty staggering. It's been estimated that EFL clubs have lost £50 million of gate income in the 1920 season. And the Premier League chief executive, Richard Masters, has come out and predicted that if there are no fans in the stadia for this coming season, that will cost clubs a total of £700 million. Looking then at the impact of this on other clubs and bodies, the RFU said that they plan to make 139 staff redundant due to £107 million in lost revenue. The ECB has announced 62 job losses and has lost £100 million this year. And that's the impact on national governing bodies, the Premier League. There's certainly a real fear that smaller clubs and the National League clubs, like you say, simply won't survive without the money from spectators. And I know that yourself and Daniel discussed on the last podcast the winding up of Macclesfield Town due to the debts that they owed. Obviously not entirely Corona related, but there's certainly a real fear that other clubs will be going the same way if the situation doesn't improve or change.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think it's also worth, mentioning, as we said, with the moving goalpost, there's such frustration at not being able to plan ahead, and indeed there are probably additional costs as a result of U-turn. So obviously thinking that they're going to have fans, planning for that, planning for the policies and measures which have to be put in place, as well as just kind of planning in terms of budgetary measures for what that will bring for them. So there is frustration and there are a lot of costs due to the changing landscape, which is, as I say, changing sort of weekly at the moment.
I mean, yeah, it's difficult enough to have a business in these circumstances, let alone, when you're preparing for one event and it just completely gets pulled from underneath you. Greatest sympathies for anyone trying to cope with it all. How's it looking elsewhere? Are England the only ones that are being a bit frustrating in this respect, or are there other examples as well?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's interesting to see what's happening with big events in other countries. And of course, the sort of other end of the spectrum is somewhere like New Zealand, where fans returned in full droves, packed stadiums in June. And of course, that was after they'd announced the first time that they had totally eradicated coronavirus. So perhaps a little unfair to make a comparison there. In other countries where there are much similar numbers, really, I think that the picture is pretty similar. So, for example, in the tennis world, the US Open tennis went ahead at the beginning of September, and that was played with no spectators whatsoever. The entire site was turned into a bubble for players, as well as essential personnel. And there were very tight restrictions on how many support members of their team they could have, coaches and things like that, and family members turn up. And then remaining on tennis theme, the French Open was postponed from May. It has just got underway and it will be underway for the next sort of week and a half from this point. They had rather grand plans, I think it's fair to say, to have 11,500 fans on site each day, divided into 3 areas. And that unfortunately was put paid to with a recent spike in COVID numbers in France. They have been able to go ahead with 1,000 fans a day. Again, the players are subjected to quite strict controls. They're subjected to regular COVID testing, and they're having to stay in one of 2 official tournament hotels. So I think similar picture. I mean, obviously can't necessarily talk about how much things are changing on a sort of daily or weekly basis. But yeah, there's kind of difficulties across the board, I think, in reaching that balance between having events going ahead and having some fans who are able to enjoy it. That's
interesting. And I suppose one of the differences, though, when you look at those big events like the French Open or the US Open, much like with the top end of football in the Premier League and the Championship as well, those sorts of events are still going to be televised. So there's some revenue coming in there. I think particularly in tennis, there's a lot of sponsorship money on the table there that comes from the broadcasting of such matches. But you compare that to amateur sports, they're not in a position to have any sort of funding coming from those sorts of sources. So how are those sort of amateur sports and other events being affected?
Yeah, so I mean, if we move to look at the impact perhaps on mass participation events, so things like London Marathon, other activities like that, which I think people are also very keen, obviously, to see be brought back insofar as they want to participate in them. And I think, you're right to say that there's a huge financial cost as well in terms of those events not going ahead. Both a question about whether they'll be able to fund themselves in future years. And there's real issues about the kind of revenue that those events bring in for charity on a sort of a yearly basis, which are really relied on by those charities as a huge part of their income stream. So in England, physical activity and participation events have been allowed to resume since the 11th of July. Again, we've got this question of what does the rule of 6 mean for that? So following the number 4 regulations being brought in mid-September, Sport England sought clarification from the government about what did that rule of 6 mean for sport and physical activity, and in particular larger scale mass participation events. And the response was that organised sports and activities that have been through what's called return to play protocols and organised outdoor sports can continue. So you're right to say that they can't necessarily ensure that participants are tested or that there are biosecure bubbles and things like that. But in terms of the measures that licensed races and events, so looking at things like running events, cycling events, triathlons, there are certain measures and protocols that those have to adhere to. So those include carrying out a COVID-19 risk assessment, measures which are intended to reduce contact between individuals and enable social distancing. That would include staggered start times, refreshments which are left on tables rather than being handed out by volunteers, water in sealed bottles and not in cups, and medals not being handed out to participants at the end of the races. And they're also having to give additional communication with the participants, giving them all of their race day information in advance. So rather than having those kind of group meetings at the beginning where the race is explained to them and any rules, those will be sent out by email in advance. Clearly, a lot of high profile events have been affected. And as I said, one of the biggest is the London Marathon, which of course takes place normally in April every year. And that was postponed from the 26th of April to the 4th of October. So that will be this weekend coming up. And at the time of the original postponement, I think like most of us, the organisers were quite optimistic that by October we'd be looking at a very different picture, and that would be long enough to enable things to go ahead in a way similarly to how they would have done in the past. Unfortunately, they haven't been able to bring off an event with mass participation. And I think it's also right to say that initially they had hoped that this kind of technology could be used with mass participants to enable social distancing. So not a bubble per se, but technology that would tell people when they'd been too close to someone else, a bit like a very advanced track and trace system. Those plans were unfortunately couldn't come to fruition. So we're looking at an elite only men's, women's and wheelchair races, which are being conducted in biosecure bubbles. It will be 19.5 laps of St. James's Park, and the participants are all staying in the same hotel outside of London. It's also a sealed off event, so there won't be any spectators, but it will be, as you say, televised. And similarly to the change of the French Open from May to October, the changes bring about sort of interesting change as well to the event itself. So all those flat loops of St. James's Park mean that it'll be a very flat course. There's an opportunity for records to be smashed. Potentially Kipchoge could come below his 2 hours and 1 minute. And that's, you know, a significant reason, I suppose, of interest for people to watch on TV, even though they can't go out and support on the day itself.
That's been one of the sort of weird things about I think all sports that's managed to continue throughout COVID is that, you know, even if there is some form of success for a club, you know, whether it's, you know, winning a particular trophy or breaking potentially a world record, it almost has that asterisk next to it saying during COVID, and it shouldn't undermine how you know good an achievement it is. But I wonder if some of the athletes are being affected by those sorts of thoughts passing through fans' minds at all.
Potentially, yeah. I mean, I know that this was also a comment that's made with Osaka winning Naomi Osaka winning the tennis, the US Open. Of course, the last time she previously won that title was in a pretty controversial final involving Serena Williams. And she sort of said, you know, hopefully one day she'll win the US Open without that kind of asterisk by her name. But I think there's also, a side with it's almost in some ways an even greater achievement, because obviously none of the players have been able to train in the same way or prepare for competition in the same way as they would have done in other years. And they are having to deal with a lot of sort of unknowns and uncertainty, and also sort of bringing a lot from within themselves in terms of kind of rising to the occasion when you haven't got those thousands of fans cheering you on. So yeah, I think there's certainly something to be said in terms of almost an additional achievement, winning in that way. But yeah, there are obviously certain drawbacks as well to that. In terms of the London Marathon, talking about the mass participation aspect, what is pretty remarkable achievement is they've also managed to sell 45,000 virtual places. So they are, like all of us, adapting to this virtual world, and participants being encouraged to run their own marathon on the same day. And that's clearly...
I've seen that's not sort of running around your own living room, but like an app that tracks where
Yeah,
you're running around London.
I don't know, and presumably you wouldn't also want to have too many of those people running in the same place. So I suspect they're left somewhat to kind of devise their own courses. But yeah, I think fortunately we're not at present in lockdown, so people aren't being restricted to that sort of lapse of your backyard or balcony or living room or anything like that.
I think it's a really good idea, and I think even I think the Great North Run did the same thing actually a few weeks ago. I remember running around Battersea Park and I saw a few people in their Great North Run gear, and I think they released an app whereby there'd be like comments from elite athletes as you were running around and trying to sort of replicate the atmosphere of doing the Great North Run as well. So I think it's a good idea, and it's a scope for more participation in those sorts of events in the future if you can't get an actual place at the event as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's obviously it's a massive effort, both to try and maintain that participant engagement and generally engagement of the wider community, but also to carry on raising those crucial funds, which we kind of alluded to, because again, there is a huge financial impact of these mass events not going ahead. There's research which suggests that the income for charities from the top 25 mass participation events could drop by £100 million in 2020. So, I mean, that is absolutely massive. And if the organisers can do anything they can to try and make sure that those charities are still supported in some way, and at the same time keep people's engagement, their physical activity, benefits for mental health, all supported, then that's obviously only of benefit. And I think it's also worth pointing out, as in terms of the achievement of the London Marathon organisers, there is also the only World Marathon Major which is taking place this year. There's been quite a lot of surprise and consternation, certainly from New York, that they've managed to get so many people signed up to the virtual race and event. So that is a really huge achievement, and contrasts in some ways, again, on the tennis side, with Wimbledon having been the only tennis Grand Slam which actually didn't go ahead this year. So in some sense, England's maybe got it right in one respect. But the impact on mass participation events generally has been varied, and I think may well be also a result of the changing landscape and the rise in infections at present. So the Blenheim Triathlon took place earlier in September of this year. Again, limited in various ways. So one spectator per entrant, about half event capacity, and a longer day. And it was, by all accounts, extremely successful. And again, I think people were just so pleased to be able to get back out competing in the way that they'd planned to and trained for before this all happened. But that hasn't necessarily translated across the board. And I think that is probably a result also of things just tightening up at the moment. So the Brighton Marathon had been rescheduled to the 11th of October. That's now cancelled. And again, they're having a virtual event instead. And Parkrun, which is, I'm sure, a big sort of weekly event, and certainly something that people participate in maybe once or a couple of times a month, that had been planned to return in England at the end of October. And the organisers are clearly extremely determined to return because of the physical and mental health benefits. And and also what parkrun organisers perceive as a limited risk of transmission at outdoor activities. So in a bit of an excerpt from the public statement that they'd put out when they were planning to return at the end of October, they had said, "We strongly believe that, as existing and emerging evidence suggests, and contrary to public opinion, there is little to no risk of COVID-19 transmission at outdoor physical activity events such as parkrun. Increasingly, we are seeing outbreaks traced to indoor work and social environments, yet to date, there is little, if any, evidence of outbreaks directly resulting from participation in outdoor physical activity events." And it's fair to say that the parkrun view on that hasn't changed, but on the 25th of September, they announced that they wouldn't be returning after all at the end of October, and it remains clearly unknown when they will be able to return. They pointed out that they are exempt from the rule of six, but that they feel it's insensitive to push forward with reopening in the current atmosphere. And I think there is a huge amount of frustration of the parkrun organisers and probably the majority of participants linked to those costs of not being able to carry on with the physical social activity. I think we're all aware of the huge mental health costs that the first lockdown brought. And there's certainly a very real fear that going into the winter, isolation and not being able to participate in physical activity, especially in a social way, will become even more difficult. So that frustration is borne out by parkrun, saying it is essential that we look beyond baseless assumptions and a culture of fear and move toward evidence-based interventions. We must act now if we are to avoid irreparable damage to the health and happiness of our communities. So that really, I think, underscores the tension in these areas, and it really is at the moment quite unclear how those will be resolved going forwards.
Yeah, it seems to be a really delicate balance of, sports bodies and organisers really wanting to get back to their full capacity or their normal flow of business. But then, of course, you have to have the very significant factor in mind of trying to keep the virus at bay and doing everything you can to get normality back sooner rather than later, rather than having these continual pushbacks from spikes in infection. So, it's really not a good place to be in for them. I really hope things get better sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and I think, as you say, that the kind of sports bodies trying to come together to persuade the government to reach some kind of plan, really, on getting out of this sort of impasse and also making sure that they can survive. So in the last week or so, the leaders of over 100 sports bodies have written a letter to Boris Johnson warning that the impact of closed stadiums and leisure facilities will lead to what they say is a lost generation of sport and activity. And in that letter, they've asked for an emergency funding package similar to the, I think, £1.57 billion support package, which was given to the arts industry in July, which they've termed as a sports recovery fund, so that the sector can survive and it can stabilise and carry on.
Well, thanks, Julia. That's really detailed analysis of, of what the guidelines are and how they're being received and implemented. And, from my perspective, it's great to see that there's been innovation in some respects and how some bodies and clubs are rising to the challenge of dealing with these guidelines. But as I say, I certainly hope, all being well in managing COVID, of course, that there's a return to normality sooner rather than later. Particularly for those bodies that you've just touched upon that are struggling financially. But I feel sure this topic will be up for further discussion as things progress.
Sure, and I'm sure we'll have some number 6 and number 7 regulations to see us through another podcast.
I'll keep you busy, I'm sure. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and keep an eye out for further podcasts from Three Hare Court Sports Law team in the future. Thanks, Julia.
Thanks, Tom.